All right, so let's explore the human operating system. We're going to start with what I call kind of the scope of mind. It's got some biology in it, some other stuff in it. It's really what's the territory that the human operating system needs to deal with. Then we're going to look particularly at patterns. And this is connected to the way in which our minds are essentially pattern processors. They're not byte processors. Our brains are huge parallel processing whatevers. And it winds up meaning that pattern is really the thing at the heart of what goes on in our minds. And then we're going to get to the optimal zone. This is where a whole bunch of emotional stuff comes in. Emotional stuff comes into the patterns as well. But anyway, I'm not going to tell you too much about the optimal zone yet. Just sort of give it out as a hint. Okay, so what is this scope of mind? I'm using mind in the big sense. It's not as just intellect or just thoughts. It's the much bigger sense that psychologists often use. So emotion and will and even subconscious is in there. In terms of what I had up here before of humans with this sort of picture, mind is essentially everything other than the physical body. It's I don't want to quite say it's the software side, but it's not necessarily the physical body, even though the physical body has a huge influence on the mind. In fact, let's look at some of that. So what's the biology of mind? It's a lot more than the brain. Starting with neurons that go all over the body. 80% of the brain's neurons are in the cerebellum back here. 1%, a tenth of a percent compared to the brain in the spinal cord. And then in our bellies, in our guts, we have what's sometimes called the brain in the gut. A huge number of neurons running along our intestinal tract. So it's all over. And then it's not just nerves. Neurotransmitters wind up being hugely important. So the chemistry of all that, and whether or not you have the support in what you're eating to get the right neurotransmitters and all these other kinds of things wind up having a real effect on your experience. And then hormones. Also hugely important in what happens in our minds. Having said all that, nevertheless, the brain is important. So let's look a little bit at the brain. First of all, brainstem, which has a lot to do with homeostasis. And there was a time a few decades ago when this would have been described as the reptilian brain. Apparently that was unfair to reptiles. So that isn't done quite so much anymore. But it's a part of the brain that we share with a vast variety of living forms. Then in the middle is what's called the limbic system, which is really important in terms of emotions. This used to be called the old mammal part of the brain. But again, that turned out not to be fair to birds. So it's known as the limbic system. And then outside of that, the neocortex, which is where most of the stuff is. And it is the part of the brain that in humans is most enlarged relative to other animals. So let's look at that. Temporal lobe, which is important for language and also important for being able to attach characteristics to like objects. It's what they call the what pathway. Then the frontal lobe, which kind of gets a lot of credit for all of the fancier thinking that we do, but is certainly only a small part of the whole picture. Then the motor cortex, where it's almost like a switchboard directly connecting. In fact, you can find up here, it's kind of inverted. This is the head. These are all the muscles associated with the head, and as you go down here, it gets down into the legs and the toes. But if you put a probe into a specific place there, a muscle will twitch. So it's very much of a very detailed switchboard. And you get something very similar on the sensory side. So I want to make the point that some parts of the brain are very detailed and specialized, whereas other parts, like the frontal lobe, are much more fluid. And then the parietal lobe, which deals with spatial stuff. So that becomes the where, not the what. And an amazing thing that we all do is to carry around these three-dimensional models in our minds. And it's the parietal lobe that gets a fair bit of credit for that. Then the occipital lobe, which is about vision, and especially about the parts of vision that break up what's coming in. This is where you find lots and lots of neuron groups whose task is to detect whether or not there's a line, and whether it's a vertical line or a horizontal line. I mean, it's all very detailed stuff. And then that cerebellum, which is about coordinating motion. And remember, 80% of the neurons were there in the cerebellum. So maybe our motion and the fact that we're able to coordinate it somehow, at least to some degree, is a pretty important part of the whole system. Now, I've gone through this step by step, and it'd be easy to get the sense that what happens in the brain looks like this. You know, you plod along item by item, step by step. In fact, what's actually going on looks a lot more like this. There's all kinds of stuff going on all the time. In fact, one of the things that I've seen is that there are about 3 billion neuron transmissions a second in the brain, to give you some sense of how busy that all is. And because it's so rich and so busy, it's too much detail to try to work with if you're doing culture change. So we need an operating system. How do we put an operating system on top of all this? And what I'm going to suggest that we do is an operating system that looks like this. At its core is awareness, which continues to be both at the core of our experience and something that nobody really quite knows how it works. Around that, facets of awareness, affect, which is sort of this agglomeration of emotions and feeling, and then pattern and memory. And building these three around the core of awareness. And then outside of that, what I'm calling cognitive modes, in terms of the linguistic linear mode, the kinesthetic somatic, and the visual spatial. And we already, with the working memory exercise, saw how if you're stuck in one of those modes, it can wind up limiting you, and you can break out of those limits by being able to tap into some of those other modes. Okay, so what about awareness? What is your awareness? What does it feel like to be a person? Well, there is this mysterious sense of being a self and having choice. Whatever philosophically you may think about free will, we all behave as if we've got it. So you have a self with choice in space and time. So imagine that you're somewhere and you're looking at something. You're out in some scene. What's in your awareness? Well, you're going to have some sense info from your seeing and your hearing and all those external senses. That's going to be part of what's in your awareness. You'll also be able to put that sense info into this three-dimensional model that you carry around in your head. So you'll have a spatial context for all that. You'll also have your internal sense info. If you tune into it, you'll be able to feel what your feet feel like, and how does your belly feel? How does the back of your neck feel? All these other things that are, what's your temperature like? All of this is all part of your awareness in that moment. Words and phrases may be there. Concepts, maybe with words attached to them, maybe not. Affect, there will be some level of emotion that you will be feeling. You'll also have a temporal context for all this, and you'll have some sense of history. And there are probably other things that would go into this too. So all of this is in your consciousness, and is conscious, and is all part of your awareness. And it is huge in terms of the overall amount of information and the diversity of information. And yet it's just what we do. It seems so natural, it's so easy, and yet when people try to do it in terms of machine intelligence, they find that it's extremely difficult to mimic all of these things, all going on simultaneously. And as if that wasn't enough, you also, those words you have, you know what parts of speech they connect with. You can associate all kinds of words with the words that were up in your mind. You know various analogies to those things and associated concepts. All of these are close to your awareness if they aren't in your awareness. And so I'm putting that down as being in your subconscious. And the point that I want to make here is that there is an enormous amount that's in our awareness. I like to call this a mind bundle. One of the things that we'll look at a little more later is the way in which your mind bundle and my mind bundle are never going to be exactly the same. We may have the same word that we're using, but our history, our immediate internal sense experience, there are all kinds of different things about what's happening in our awareness that is unique to us in that moment. So let's talk a little bit more about this conscious and subconscious. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which I found very helpful in this sense. It's not just about conscious and subconscious. It's also about fast thinking and slow thinking. Fast thinking is associational thinking in which you get to see the result, but you don't see the process. The subconscious brings the process up. And this is where our habits are. You couldn't drive a car if you didn't have this ability of fast thinking. You couldn't speak if you didn't have the ability of fast thinking. Fast thinking is enormously important for us. But it's prone to all kinds of errors. It's easy to trick. The psychologists love to come up with all kinds of different ways in which they show that your fast thinking trips you up. So there's also slow reflective thinking, in which you get to see the process as well as the result. And you can be more accurate. You're less trickable when you're doing the slow reflective thinking, but you're slow. If you had to go through life based only on that slow reflective thinking, it would be tough. But one of the ways in which they really partner together is that you can use your slow reflective thinking to modify your fast thinking. This is the way you change habits, by becoming aware of them, or create new habits where you go through intentionality. It's like when you were learning to type, you had to think about where your fingers were going initially until you got to the point where things clicked in enough that it was all then fast thinking, just habit.